Hello, welcome. I'm Olivia Mattis. Glad to be here on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. Last week, I was out with COVID, my first time in all 4 years, but now I'm back among the living. Here I am back with you, and I'm so happy to be back. Today's program follows up on a program we did not that long ago. We showed a beautiful film about the Ritchie boys. And so today we're doing a book discussion following up on that same topic, telling the story of one character who was a Ritchie boy. We have as our guests, of course, the author of the book. The book is called Max's War, and the author is Libby Fischer Hellmann. And her bio is that she left a career in broadcast news in Washington, D.C., and moved to Chicago a long time ago, where she began writing crime fiction. She soon began writing historical fiction as well. She's been nominated for many awards in the mystery and crime writing community and has even won a few. She's been a finalist twice for the Anthony and the Seamus, and 4 times for Forward Magazine's Book of the Year. She has been nominated for the Agatha, the Daphne, and she won the Chicago Writers Association Book of the Year in 2021. Max's War is her latest novel, and it's part of a series of historical novels. When I asked Libby, as I always do with our authors, who she wanted to have as her dialogue partner, I always give authors the choice of who they want. She said there was only one person that she wanted to have, and that's her daughter, Robin. And so Robin Hellmann is with us. She is an East Coast-based talent manager specializing in the representation of social media content creators. And she will be starting us off. She will be interviewing her mother, and she will be moderating your questions. So please type your questions into the chat box. We do not recognize raised hands, so we do ask you to type questions out. And of course, we do have Libby's book available for purchase. So we will be putting the link in the chat box throughout the program in case you too would like to have a copy of her brilliant book for yourself, for a loved one, for a friend. It's yours for the ordering. So Robin, let me turn the floor to you. Go ahead and
Wonderful.
take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Robin. I'm very excited to be here today to moderate and introduce my mother, Libby Fischer Hellmann. To kick things off, I'm going to give you a little context about her book, Max's War. The character, the protagonist, Max, is based on the story of my grandfather, her late father-in-law, Manfred Hellmann. Of course, the character in the book's name is Max. So if you hear us saying Manfred or Fred or Oppa, that is referring to the real man, and Max is the character in her novel his story is based on. So to start there, Mom, why did you decide to write a book about Oppa's World War II experience?
Thanks, Robin, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm delighted that Olivia invited us. I have always been drawn to books about World War II, and I think it's because it was the last war that had such clarity between good and bad. I mean, there was no doubt who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And it was also all over the globe on every continent. Um, Oppa or Fred did serve in the US Army. He had a pretty dramatic story to tell, but like many people many veterans of World War II, he didn't like to talk about it. So there's still an air of mystery about what he did. He really wouldn't tell about it. Still, over the years, a couple of, well, more than a couple, maybe half a dozen anecdotes slipped out to his sons, which then I was told by my husband, and Robin was told about them too. But I wanted to, at one point, when he talked about interrogating POWs and doing counterintelligence, I immediately thought of the Ritchie boys. I knew just barely something about them. And actually, my brother-in-law and I wondered if Fred could have been a Ritchie boy. So I looked into it. I could not find any evidence that he was, but what he was, what he after basic training, he was recruited by the OSS and he was sent up to Canada. And he was trained in Canada to do exactly what the Ritchie boys were doing during the war. So I figured that it was pretty authentic to take the anecdotes that I had from him and fill them into a fictional book that was based on substantive research. That wasn't nearly all, I mean, I did an amazing amount of research, which I'll tell you about later.
Most of the section on Max's war is set in it's set in a part of Germany that Opa was actually from, Regensburg. Can you give us an idea of what that area was like, what his upbringing was like, a little bit of background on who he was before the war started?
Yes, I would love to. The Max, Max and Fred were raised in affluence. He grew up in Regensburg. He had his own pony and cart. There was household help everywhere. If you know Regensburg, it was a center for trade for centuries, ever since the Roman Empire. Beautiful city, one of the richest in Europe, near Munich. It was at the crossroads of the Danube River. Curiously, it was not bombed by the Allies. I think there was one bomb that was, well, that was dropped, but that was it. There's a cathedral, there's a beautiful stone bridge. It was a city that was thriving, and there was a very active Jewish quarter in Regensburg. So I wanted people to understand Max's background.
Mm-hmm.
And to that end, go ahead, Robin. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think that it's a good segue into a reading that you wanted to share from that part.
I would love to share it. This is at the very beginning of the book. December 1932, Regensburg, Germany. Opa Steiner used to say that animals had a sixth sense that helped them predict the future. Opa would have known he'd been a successful racehorse breeder. Now, as Max Steiner hurried out of his father's shop into the winter air, his pony Clara whinnied and tossed her head. Was she impatient because Max had kept her waiting in the cold? Or did she know some significant event or change was about to occur? Max checked his wristwatch and groaned. He'd have to ponder Clara's foresight later. He was late for Shabbos. Max scrambled up to the carriage bench, lithe and agile as only a 12-year-old boy could be. Sorry, old girl. He grabbed the reins. The horse was turning 15, but that wasn't old for ponies, especially Morgan's. Although she was older than Max, he liked to mimic his father, who called every mare old girl, even if she was a filly. But there's good news for you, Clara. My bicycle will be ready next week. Papa wasn't there, but Jonas promised, which means you can look forward to a good long rest. He stapled Clara behind their home, an attractive stone-tiled house with a mansard roof, then ran up to his room and changed into a white shirt and his favorite green sweater. His mother always told him the sweater made his blue eyes appeared green. With his light brown hair, rosy complexion, and nimble body, she would say he would be fighting off girls when he grew up. Max was still too young to appreciate her predictions. He'd rather be the star of the school's track and field team. After Max's mother lit candles and welcomed in the Sabbath, Max recited the hamotzi, the blessing over the bread. His father made the blessing over the wine. They skipped the ritual of washing their hands. They were Reform, more liberal than Orthodox Jews, although their synagogues still used traditional prayer books. During the dinner, Max's father says, "There's something we need to discuss." He glanced at Max's mother and raised his eyebrows. "You told me your flat tire was due to a nail you must have picked up. Is that right?" Max licked his lips. "I did." He looked down at his bowl. "And the bent frame occurred when you fell and the bicycle crashed on the concrete of the schoolyard." Max nodded, still without looking at his father. His father cleared his throat. "Jonas came to me the day after you dropped it off. He said you weren't telling the truth." "How can you say that? How would he know?" "Because Jonas could not find the nail." but he did discover that the tire was slashed on the rim. Max kept his mouth shut. And as far as the bicycle frame is concerned, it seems that someone smashed it with a hammer. Max ran his tongue around his lips. So here's what I think. I believe you're trying to hide the fact that you were picked on by some Hitler youth bullies. Max didn't reply. That's how it starts, Moody said. Today a bully, tomorrow a Nazi. His father waved a hand to silence his mother. She bit her lip.
Wonderful. Thank you. So most of that section of Max's War, we know it's set in Regensburg. You gave us a little context on that. Something we always heard growing up was about Opa's prize-winning ponies. So that I appreciate sort of getting that context and then seeing it fictionalized. But you tell the story of what happened in that part of Germany when Hitler came to power and how then it dominoed and affected the family from there. Why did you go in that direction?
I had a point that I wanted to make, and it was this. When most of us, particularly young people, think of the Holocaust, we have this general picture of horror, terror, blackness, and the inability to do anything about it, which of course is all true. But I don't think that people know exactly what happened to create that terror and that horror. I don't think people know the laws that the Nazis passed between 1933 and 1939 when the war was when the war started. So in that section in Germany, I wanted to go through more or less chronologically, and I picked out what I thought the laws, the most important laws were that affected Jews. I may not have hit all of them, but certainly the Nuremberg laws in 1935 were key when Hitler took away Jews' citizenships and their ability to do work with our Aryans and inability to hire an Aryan and loss of voting rights and all of those. But there were a host of laws before that, mostly a lot in education, a lot in the school, and a host of laws after that. So even if people don't remember it, I want people to know that all of this terror was, quote, legally done by a government that was in place. That's important to know.
What would you consider to be the most devastating law or the most insidious law that came out that really propelled things in the wrong direction?
Well, aside from the Nuremberg laws, there was something called protective custody, and it began in the mid-30s. And I talk about it in the book. Max's father was the victim of protective custody. What it was basically the Gestapo picked up Jews that they felt were making trouble, and they sent them to a concentration camp. In this case, it was mostly Dachau, because Dachau was very close to Munich and Regensburg. They threw them into Dachau. They took their clothes. They took everything from them. They beat them. They treated them as badly as concentration camp inmates were later on. They were humiliated, they were starved, they were told to do things like scrub a toilet with a toothbrush. And they were told that they had, committed crimes against the Third Reich. It was basically systemic persecution of Jews, and it definitely foreshadowed the camp. They put Max's father, not Fred, they put Max's father in there for 2 or 3 weeks for a trumped up charge. But the thing was, they let them out after about 3 weeks or a month, and they said, get out of Germany. This is your warning. Get out of Germany. And a lot of people did. A lot of Jews did at that point.
Speaking of people that did, I actually brought a visual aid. So I have a copy of Uma's passport from when her citizenship was revoked. So my Uma was obviously my Opa's wife, who had gotten out, and you'll probably see a resemblance. But what I have here is a picture of her passport.
Oh, wonderful.
And if you look carefully, so there's the stamp of the Third Reich, and then the tail of the eagle, you can see the swastika from the government. I think this was 1937 or 38.
Did it say Miriam or no, Sarah?
It says Lucy,
Oh, okay.
Luci, which we all never knew she spelled it that way in Germany either. And I actually named my daughter after her. She is. Yeah. So moving on, back to the part about how you said, they put them into Dachau for, I think you said 3 months, and then they said, get out of here. So that's why the family moved to Holland then?
Yes. Okay. And they were in Holland for several years, and that was the most normal period of time Max had. He had friends. They lived outside the Jewish quarter. He met Jewish friends. He went to school. He learned Dutch. He also,
and this is Max the character, not
Max the character. Okay. And he had a girlfriend, and because of what happened to them in Germany, he wanted to rescue her. She was a girl from the red light district, and he wanted to rescue her and bring her into a world that he knew. And you'll read about how that went. But he definitely fell in love. She was the love of his life.
Well, then I guess I don't need to ask you if he fell in love at Holland. So we obviously we're out here because we're interested about the Ritchie boys, and what that heavily entails is Camp Ritchie. Can you share with everyone what exactly was Camp Ritchie? What did the recruits do? Why was it important? Why are we still studying it now?
Okay. Well, it's important to know that this is probably the rarest story from World War II. Practically nobody knows it. Just a quote aside, I was at the World War II Air Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania in June, and we had a booth. The Ritchie Boy Museum had a booth, and people would come up and say, "What's the Ritchie Boy Museum?" And I'd say, "Well, we'd say, had you ever heard of the Ritchie Boys?" 9 out of 10 people had never heard of them. So it was a great opportunity to educate, but it was also how much education still needs to be done. And I will get to more details in a second, but I wanted to set this up with a second reading, which is quite short, but it's from his, he's just arrived at Camp Ritchie after going through basic training. After enlisting and going to basic training, they pulled him out to go to Camp Ritchie. Max was eager to start the German Army organization class. He figured he had a head start. His father had brought home his uniform from the Great War along with his Luger, and Max had asked his father lots of questions about his decals and patches. Plus, he'd seen plenty of Wehrmacht soldiers and SS men when he was still in Germany. But he hadn't realized all the changes in German war uniforms over the months and years, or the variations depending on a soldier's assignment. The instructor, a man who looked about 10 years older than Max and said to call him Kent, took them through some of the changes. The folks at Camp Ritchie had managed to get a couple of German uniforms from the North Africa campaign. Max didn't dare ask how, and one was being modeled at the front of the room. Those of you from Germany probably recognize the field gray tunic, jack boots, and color patches on the tunic's collar that indicate a soldier's branch. As you can see, shoulder patches and colors display the soldier's regiment. White represents infantry. Kent pointed to the patches. Since the war began, however, tunics have changed colors. Leather suspenders were added and company numbers were removed from shoulder patches. But now suspenders are cloth, not leather, and helmet decals have been removed. Astonished at the details the Americans had sussed out about German uniforms, Max took copious notes. Kent looked out at the class. Now, why am I telling you all this? Anyone want to take a guess? One soldier raised his hand. So that we'll know who we're dealing with, even if the uniforms aren't identical? Not a bad guess, Kent said. Anyone else? Another recruit raised his hand. So that if we ever have to impersonate a krauthead, we'll know we have options. Good answer, soldier. That's part of it. He waited. Max had no idea, but he straightened up, keen to hear Kent's response. Anecdotally, we hear the Germans are suffering from battle fatigue, and their uniforms indicate it. Supplies are tightening up, and the materials they're using are cheaper. Some soldiers are wearing years-old tunics, helmets, and decals. Of course, it's not just their uniforms, it's their tanks and their weapons as well. Panzers are notorious for breaking down. In short, the Wehrmacht is exhausted, even Rommel. That's great news for us. So be aware of that when you see Germans, even officers whose uniforms aren't uniform. Kent grinned. That's why. That's the cover of the book, Max's War. So who exactly were the Ritchie boys? You may know by now, but they were basically 2,300 German and Austrian immigrants, mostly Jewish men. But there were also hundreds of Italians, Russians, Poles, Greeks, Japanese, Norwegians, and US-born soldiers. They were drafted, or they enlisted, they were trained in intelligence and interrogation, and then they were sent back to Europe to fight behind enemy lines. And here's a breakdown of how it looked by religion and country of birth. You can see that the US does account for 54% and that Germany is only 15%, but the Jewish population was 18%. They weren't called Ritchie boys until the 2000s, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. They were just called the Military Intelligence Training Center recruits. Okay, go ahead. This is Camp Ritchie. This is the way it looked in the 40s. And hold on a second. It's located in Cascade, Maryland, not too far from DC. It's about 70 miles because the Army leaders wanted the new camp to be near DC. It's basically 632 acres that had been used by the National Guard for a training camp since 1926. It's named for a Maryland governor. The formal name was the Military Intelligence Training Center, MITSI, but everyone called it Camp Ritchie. Okay, you can go to the next one. Once a popular resort area, the camp had a view of the Catoctin Mountain, which is part of the Appalachian Blue Ridge mountain chain. In fact, FDR had a summer home a few miles away called Shangri-La. Anybody have an idea of what it's called today? Well, I'll tell you, it's now called Camp David. A little background on how the camp came to be. In April 1941, a good 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Great Britain agreed that the US could send military observers to learn intelligence gathering from the Brits. In 1939, when the war began, Churchill had centralized their wartime intelligence efforts, and it was going pretty well. Everyone learned the same thing the same way. And the US system intelligence was pretty scattershot at that time. Back in the US, the officers recommended a similar centralized program. So after the US entered the war, Secretary of War Henry Stimson approved a plan in May of 1942 to set up a specialized training camp in intelligence. 2 months later, the camp started receiving recruits. They settled on Camp Ritchie, not just because of the mountain or the lake. The forests and the mountains around the lake were just what the military needed for soldiers to practice. So they leased a chunk of the surrounding forests and mountains from the state of Maryland so that soldiers could practice what they had learned. And this is an aerial shot that gives you a really good sort of overview. Okay, go ahead. Brigadier General Charles Banfield, was the head of the camp. Apparently, he was kind of a salty character with a flair for the dramatic, kind of like a Patton. I don't know who the second man is with him, but I have a feeling it might be a man named Shipley Thomas, who was British and was a decorated World War I veteran. At the beginning, they had a number of British instructors to actually teach the courses, but pretty soon those were taken over by the Americans. Okay, we'll go ahead. When the first recruits got there, they found a lot of mud because the place was still under construction. Over the years, there was about $5 million spent to build barracks, which you see under construction here, classrooms, cafeterias, mess halls, a new water system. And the camp eventually had a theater, a parade ground, 2 tennis courts, and 2 man-made lakes. You saw one of them for boating and swimming and water exercises. There was even a chapel, which was used for both Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish religious services. It's important to know that Camp Ritchie was top secret and classified, and it remained that way until 1998. Recruits couldn't even tell their families where they were. They certainly couldn't tell them what they were doing. And even though it's better known now, it's, as I said, one of the lesser known stories of World War II. The first class started, as I said, in July. There were a lot of classes taught, but the 3 most important that you see there were order of battle, interrogation techniques, and counterintelligence. By the way, all of the classes were taught in German. And so for the Italians, all the classes were taught in Italian, and the same for the Greeks and the Norwegians, which is really something. And the other thing is that Banfield had a way of getting whatever he wanted. If he told the War Department, I need this or I need that, he got it. And that often went on because as time went on, some of the classes proved not to be quite as relevant as others, and new classes were always starting. And so there was a constant flow and a constant syllabus that changed. In fact, there were people, while there were between the Ritchie boys and the other, the people from the men from other countries, there were about 5,200 of them, but there were a total of 20,000 people that came to Camp Ritchie, and those were more advanced soldiers or more advanced military officers that only came for 1 or 2 courses. Maybe they came for counterintelligence, maybe they came for order of battle. But they just came for 1 or 2. The semester was 8 weeks long, and the subjects as might change, but the length of the program did not. Generally, the first 5 weeks, students took classes on many different topics, took part in mock drills and exercises and simulations. The last 3 weeks were a little more specialized, and they were evaluated. And this was a very hard course to pass. Over half of the Ritchie wannabes, I call them Ritchie, didn't make it to the end of training. A class of 30 starting out might only produce 9 or 10 Ritchie boys by the end. Okay, the most complex was order of battle. It sounds almost impossible to master, which you'll see in a moment. It was a compendium that included knowledge of everything you could possibly know about the enemy, the size of the unit, who was in command, what rank the uniform decals and badges signified, where the unit was located, where they were going, how was their morale, the history of the squad, how were they transported. More broadly, they had to know everything they could find out about the enemy uniforms and ranks, insignias. And go ahead, you can go to the armory. There was an armory of enemy guns, and the recruits had to know how to operate them, how to recognize them, and how to use them. Let's go to the Panzers. This is a great one. They couldn't get, there was 1 tank that they got, but they obviously couldn't get 6 or 7 Panzers. So if you look really closely, if you want to go in close on that map, you can see that there's like a wooden or cardboard cutout, and that you can just see the wheels of the cars underneath. And so there were processions of Panzers in simulations where the recruits had to figure out what to do with them, where they were going, and how to deal with them. There were a few esoteric units too. there was a cavalry, both the Germans and the Japanese had horsemen fighters and bicycle corps, and all of the information that could be consolidated was put into something called the Red Book. The Red Book was researched and updated regularly, practically every week, and every Ritchie boy got a copy. Unfortunately, they couldn't take them out into the field, because what if the Germans captured them and they had access to the Red Book? So they had to basically memorize everything that they learned, which was, I think, an amazing feat to do in less than 8 weeks. Here you see someone pointing out some of the decals or some of the insignias, and behind him is a chart of some different ranks, I believe, of Italians and Germans. Interrogation techniques was the second class that was taught. Here you see some interrogation scenes. And there was so much to learn. I'm not going to do justice in a couple of minutes. Interrogators were told they could never physically assault a prisoner of war. The US was following the Geneva Conventions, even though the Germans weren't. However, they could coerce a prisoner to talk in other ways. For example, they could make them stand for hours. They could make them stand without relieving themselves. They could withhold food. They could make it really hot inside the rooms or the tents, or really cold. So they had their ways, and they could lie, because that's what interrogators often did. They always started off with a statement that made the POW think the interrogator knew everything and more about the enemy unit. And this would be something called by intelligence or in the Red Book. So we hear your captain, blah, 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 is really losing morale. That was done to induce the recruit to say, well, if he knows that, then he probably knows everything. I may as well talk. It worked quite well. Remember that most of the Germans, like all the other troops involved in the war, were young. A lot of them were not well educated, and they were scared. Their biggest fear of German soldiers was being captured by the Soviet military. And so occasionally an interrogator might dress as a Soviet officer and pretend to be ready to take the prisoner to a Russian camp if he wasn't talking to the American interrogator. And another strategy, which was an anecdote that we heard from Fred, was to be a buddy with one of the interrogators would actually pretend he was another POW from a different unit who happened to be housed with the interrogator from Germany. And they would talk, and that he would make up where he was and what had happened to his unit. And then the German would tell him what happened to his unit. And then 2 days later, when it came time for the officers to make a decision what to do with that German soldier, Fred showed up in his US military uniform and surprised the German quite a bit when he saw that he had been duped. Sometimes they were interrogated in tents, but other times they were in pens, depending on where they were keeping the prisoners. Counterintelligence was the third most important course, and I made it very broad because so many of the classes could fall under counterintelligence. Here you see aerial maps and terrain intelligence. If we go to another counterintelligence, you see recruits, signals intelligence. They all had to learn Morse code, by the way, and they also had to learn it at a special speed or they would flunk. They also had mobile radio broadcasts. They had to learn how to use radio communications equipment, and they had to identify enemy equipment. Here in counterintelligence, we have people looking at a cutout house. They were taught how to conduct raids and searches, where they learned how to capture people inside. They had close combat. They hired a professional wrestler for that. And here, are we on the village yet? Yeah, let's go to the village. They actually built a German village with a bell tower on the left. They used that for how the Americans were going to capture an entire town. I mentioned a couple more slides, a Nazi rally. I mentioned in the theater, every 6 weeks, they would have a mock Nazi rally to give the recruits the gestalt of what the Germans were like and how fervent they were. And here you see someone impersonating Goering at a rally, but they had a guy play Hitler who was apparently a really nice guy. They had learned camouflage. We can go to the next one. How to hide themselves, a sniper nest in the woods or hiding in plain sight in a cornfield. And one thing, after they went through and they passed all that, all their tests and were certified as a Ritchie boy, they took them all to Hagerstown, Maryland, to City Hall, where they swore them in as American citizens. Which was very nice because some of them had been classed as enemy aliens before. I would like to read something that tells you what happened to Max after his training at Camp Ritchie. And he ended up being deployed with the OSS, and it really did happen. Ritchie boys, because maybe the OSS fellows didn't know German or they didn't know the right language to talk to, they ended up doing missions together. So just a second to explain the history behind this passage, and I'm sure some of you already know it. Max is deployed to the OSS. They're in occupied France, and their mission is to assassinate Klaus Barbie. They know Barbie is on his way to an orphanage to arrest and kill a group of Jewish children secretly held. As you know, this actually did happen in Izu in April 1944, but I changed the situation and the timeline. In my story, children were rescued by organized groups who got them to Switzerland, and Max and his fellow soldiers planted explosives at the now empty orphanage. They would detonate the explosives when Barbie entered the front door, the butcher of Lyon. But then this happened. A man in a snappy civilian suit emerged from the back seat, Klaus Barbie. For years when living in Holland, Max had wanted to see him in the flesh. Barbie wore an overcoat, but it wasn't buttoned. Max was surprised at how short he was, perhaps only 5'5". Photographs had made him seem taller. His hair was brown and his eyes dark. A buzz skimmed Max's nerves. He felt hot and cold at the same time. He pulled out his carbine, sighted down the rifle, and focused on Barbie. Max had him. He could easily make the shot. He started to shake again, and beads of sweat broke out. He wasn't sure he could wait. Freddie looked over and saw Max on the precipice. He grabbed Max's rifle, pointed the front end up in the air, and vehemently shook his head. Max knew what Freddie was doing. If he shot Barbie now, he'd kill him, but the mission would become a bloodbath, and there was a good chance they'd never leave occupied France alive. Freddie kept his hand on Max's carbine until he was sure Max wouldn't do anything crazy. Barbie waited for his bodyguards to surround him, then slowly walked up to the lodge. At the same time, a shout came out from one of the other men. It sounded like it was coming from the second floor. Max craned his neck up. One of the SS men had opened it and yelled down, "Come up! There's a child! Hurry!" Barbie stayed where he was, but motioned to one of his bodyguards to go up. Max, who grabbed the plunger when the shouting started, went rigid. "Go inside, Barbie, go inside," he muttered, but Barbie stayed where he was. No, inside," Max said. Freddie threw him a look that said, "Shut up." A moment later, the SS man came downstairs and appeared at the door of the lodge. In his arms was a small child, a little girl, not more than 3 years old. Max guessed. Where had she been? How had they missed her? She wasn't crying, but she clutched the SS officer's jacket as if her life depended on it. Max and Freddie exchanged horrified glances. How could they blow up the lodge now? An innocent child would be killed, an innocent Jewish child. Was the life of one little girl worth giving up all that, even temporarily? It was. In the end, Max couldn't do it. 24 hours later, they were back in London, where they got stinking drunk. Max and Freddie never discovered who the little girl was or why she'd been left behind. They guessed she'd been panicked at the noise and disruption caused by the rescue groups who'd come the previous night and hid. Their last sight of the little girl was in the back seat of Barbie's car, sitting next to the butcher of Lyon. Tears welled up in Max's eyes. The image of the little girl happily chatting with the monster on her way to her death would be seared into Max's memory forever.
My God, what a passage. This is a real page turner, and I hope everybody in the audience will order a copy. So we're going to put in the chat box the order page so that you can get your own copy. And also after today's program, you will be getting an email with information, same information on how to order. So right now I'm just going to make a few announcements, and then we will turn to your questions. So next week is our last September program. And then we're taking a break for the Jewish holidays, and we'll see you again in late October. Jewish holidays are very late this year. So we've had 3 programs in September. We'll have 1 in October. So next week, we're turning to the story of the Kindertransport operation. And we've had several programs about the Kindertransport operation, showing different films. The film we're showing next week is unlike any of the other films that we've shown. The other films have focused on the rescue process. And this film that we're showing next week, which is called My Knees Were Jumping, focuses on the Kindertransport survivors themselves, their psychology. It was one of the very first films made about this story. It was made by Melissa Hacker, whose mother was a Kindertransport survivor. Her mother is throughout the film. And it's a fascinating look, not only at the psychology of these Kindertransport survivors themselves, but also of the transmission of memory to the second and third generations. I know that many people in our audience are second and third generations, so you will find it of particular interest, I think. It's really a film that's not to be missed, and we're going to show you a little trailer of the film called My Knees Were Jumping.
In the 9 months leading up to World War II, nearly 10,000 children from Nazi Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were sent to safety in England. My mother was one of these children.
The day he was brought back, there were 2 men with him, and I heard the second man calling up and in effect saying, "Shall we take him in again?" And I knew instinctively if he ever were taken back again, he'd never come out. And I think it was that which made my parents decide to send me away.
All of us, including the children, had a very clear sense of absolute danger, of the malice of the world around us.
I thought, this was an adventure and I would go and my parents would follow. It was no big deal. And that's how we went into this. A little afraid, but sort of also feeling that it was an adventure. We were going to something better. Remember?
So even if you've seen other films about the Kindertransport story, or if you feel you already know a lot about the story, you still will want to see this film that's quite unique and quite wonderful. So I urge everybody to sign up and tell all your friends. So now we're going to turn back to Robin, who's going to moderate your questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to do my best to get to everyone's, but obviously I don't know if we'll have time for everyone's. The first question that I saw was, could we hear about Max and families leaving Europe and arriving in the US?
Well, I can't tell you all of it because it would ruin the story, but Max spent 3 years in Holland. He, his girlfriend from Regensburg actually went to Shanghai. So there's a whole part of the story that takes place in Shanghai where, as you probably know, Jews were confined to, ultimately confined to a ghetto, but they weren't killed. But it wasn't, it was not a great place for them to be. But in terms of Europe, Max gets a ship. After the Nazis invaded Holland, Max knew he had to get out, and his parents had some visas that they had been waiting to use, and they didn't think they were going to have to use them, but they gave them to him, and he hitched a ride. Oh, this is a true story. This is a true anecdote as well. Fred hitched a ride to Rotterdam in the back of a truck that was filled with coffins. And that's all we knew. And so I don't know if the coffins were filled or not filled, and he didn't say. But then he got to New York, and he stayed in New York, and then he went down to Philadelphia because his sponsor was in Philadelphia, and he started working, but he was drafted in 1939. I'm
Next
sorry,
question.
he was drafted in 41. My mistake. He came over in 39. He was drafted in 41.
Did any of the soldiers who trained at Camp Ritchie serve in the Pacific?
Yes, there were many of the Ritchie boys went to the Pacific. I did not deal with that theater because I couldn't. There was just too much information. So I had to make a choice. And since we were about Germany and Austria, I decided to focus on that. But there were actually Japanese people that also were there as Ritchie boys, although at the time the Japanese were considered alien residents and they weren't allowed to fight in World War II. So they were doing interrogation work and intelligence, but they couldn't fight.
Next question was, did any of the Ritchie boys have family members in concentration and extermination camps? Did any try to help them?
There certainly were members of the family that were in camps. Fred's entire family was in a camp. And there was nothing during the war that they could do. After the war was a different situation. I do deal with that in Max's War a little bit. Interesting, curiously, coincidentally, I guess, one of the biggest displaced refugee camps was right in the suburbs of Regensburg. So Max goes back to Regensburg where he tries to find some of his relatives. But well, you'll see what happens.
Were there not a few tragedies wherein some Ritchie boys were killed by US soldiers who mistakenly thought they were German?
I'm not aware of that. It went the reverse way. There were some Germans that sussed out that two men were actually Americans. They were in German uniforms. They were pretending to be German soldiers. And they, unfortunately, are two of the only Ritchie boys who were killed during the war.
Did the Jewish Ritchie boys keep their names, or were they changed before they went to the war?
Oh, good point, which I didn't have time to bring out. They were changed. When they went to Hagerstown, they were told to choose a very bland name, last name and first name, an American first name. And a lot of them kept those names after the war. Some, like Manfred, went back to his name, but a lot of them didn't.
Beautiful. And then I think we have time for one more. Someone said that they had an instructor at Fort Bragg in 1981 that was a strict lieutenant colonel with a German accent. He taught interrogation techniques, and it never occurred to me that he could be Jewish. Is it possible that he was a Ritchie boy?
Very possible. It's very possible. In a different presentation that I do, I have a list of famous Ritchie boys, and you'd be surprised who was a Ritchie boy. And they weren't all Jewish either, particularly the ones that were born in the US. I mean, obviously they were whatever they were, but the ones from Germany and Austria were majority Jewish.
Well, that is all that I have. I mean, I guess I could finish with a question for me.
Sure.
Are you aware that I have a keepsake from that Opa sent to Oma when he was in Canada and he couldn't tell anybody where he was? I have a pin that says Halifax, Nova Scotia on two little maple leaves that are connected by, I should have grabbed it. It's in like a jewelry box, and I was making, did you know I have that?
I did. You did tell me that. That's a wonderful artifact.
I never knew what it meant. I just was told not to lose it. And now I know it was because he was stationed in Canada and he couldn't tell her where he was. And that was his way of telling, telling his bride to be that he was okay. And a little more information about where he was, he probably shouldn't have shared.
Yeah, he shouldn't have done it, but he did anyway. Okay.
All right. Well, that is it on the Q&A.
So now, Libby, if you have some final thoughts you'd like to make to our audience, this would be the time.
As I said before, at the beginning, Max's War is based on historically accurate information. I did research for 4 months before I even decided I could write the book, because World War II is such a complex story. Everyone has a World War II story, and I had to pick and choose what I used, but 2 sources were really quite helpful. One was Sons and Soldiers by Bruce Henderson, so if you want to read more. And the other one is more of a textbook, but it became my Bible, and it's called Secrets of the Ritchie Boys by a woman named Beverly Driver Eddy. And she's also from Pennsylvania. She was a professor at Dickinson. Now she's retired, but she has a wonderful book about them as well. But aside from the Holocaust, building of the Holocaust, and an actual war story, which Max's War is, and that's kind of how it's different than just the Holocaust stories that are much more widely known. It does have other elements. It ranges from the coming of age of an innocent boy, a young man who copes with a life he never expected or could have imagined, even a love story, the love story with a Dutch woman who wasn't Jewish. Before I made the decision, when I made the decision to write it, one of the reasons that led me to it was that the Ritchie boys were unique. They had a chance to fight back, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. Most important, and what I hope readers will take away from the book, is the enormous challenge that these soldiers faced. Many of them suffered personally at the hands of the Nazis. They lost their families, they lost their homes, they lost their culture, but they went back to that place of suffering to stop the carnage of Hitler, and they ultimately triumphed. So, were the Ritchie boys heroes? Was Max? After reading Max's War, I hope you can answer that question.
Wonderful. Well, we love presenting stories of rescue and resistance and agency, Jewish agency, instead of Jewish victimhood. We love stories like this.
Well, that's what you'll find.
So Thank you so much, Libby Fischer Hellmann, for writing the book and for presenting it to us here today. Thank you, Robin, for your expert moderation. And I love seeing the banter between mother and daughter. That's always so wonderful to see. Audience, so nice to be back. Lovely to see you all. Hope you will all join us next week for the film My Knees Were Jumping. The program is called We Were the Lucky Ones, the psychology of the Kindertransport survivors. So that will be another very important program. I certainly hope you will join us and you'll get an email with all of the details. So thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.